Thank you very much, Brother Gibbs, for the introduction. Thank you to all at Ohio History Connection for bringing us together for this important work. Thank you in absentia to Pastor Gilliard and for Brother Richardson and all those at Shiloh Baptist for opening up this historic and magnificent sanctuary and building and complex for us to do this important work today. It is good to be with you. It is good to see familiar faces, people whose work here in Columbus I admire greatly, and I am grateful for the opportunity to share a few words on sort of the movement as a whole, to identify some themes that perhaps can help us organize and arrange our conversation today. I know we are working on a schedule, and so I will be mindful of time. I was thinking about that as I was on my way over. I actually was in New York this morning and flew back in today, and I said, when I get here, I got to make sure I don't get a little carried away. You get in the Baptist church, you get a little carried away. And I said, I have my watch. My wife gave me one of these newfangled iPhone watches, and usually I would take my watch off and set it aside, but I can't figure out how to get the thing to stay on. But I said, that's all right, because I'm going to Shiloh, a Baptist church, a Black Baptist church. And anybody who's ever been in a Black Baptist church, there's usually two things you know are going to be around. One, usually you're going to have a white Jesus behind you, but that's a separate story. But the other thing, you know you're going to have a clock dead center. So I'm in good shape. I got my eye on the clock. So I'm not worried about my newfangled watch that does everything but tell time, but that's another story. So there are a number of myths and misconceptions that still persist about the civil rights movement. A number of myths and misconceptions that still persist about the civil rights movement. And I want to run through a couple of these and then spend the balance of my time going back over them, if you will, and just kind of pointing out how we ought to be thinking about sort of the truth behind these myths and misconceptions. The first has to do with periodization. The first has to do with chronology. So periodization. And actually, Barb reached out to me the other day and said, Hasan, could you identify, are there some themes we talked about? Have you pinned them down yet? And I said, yeah, of course. And so I shot them to her. And then, of course, as I was flying in today, I started adding stuff. So my apologies. My wife says I do that all the time, but it is what it is, right? So the first is periodization. There is a common misunderstanding that the civil rights movement begins in the mid-1950s and ends in the 1960s, right? Either ends in 1964, 65 with the major federal legislation, Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, or ends in 1968 with the death of Martin Luther King. What we want to do is take a more expansive chronological look at the movement. Second, regionalization. There is a myth, a misconception that what we call the civil rights movement was confined to the South. It was confined to those places where formal segregation existed. Regionalization. Leadership. You have the myth that the movement was led by a single person, that it was Martin Luther King. So this king-centric sort of leadership misconception. 4, goals. There's a misconception that the goals of the movement were confined to either simply civil rights or securing major federal legislation. That the goals of the movement are somehow confined to the work of people was simply to gain federal legislation, Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act. The goals of the movement, as I'll talk about in a second, were far more expansive than that. More expansive in terms of the civil rights goals, but then also in terms of the human rights objectives as well. Strategies. Another one of the major myths about the movement, and I know these are myths because my students come with them every year to Ohio State, good students, but they don't know nothing. Another one of the major myths is connected to strategies, right? That the dominant philosophy undergirding the strategies of the movement, or the singular philosophy, was nonviolence, as though everybody believed that nonviolence was the way to go forward, and believed in it philosophically, not just tactically, believed in it deeply. There were a range, in reality, there's a range of strategies, philosophical strategies that we need to unpack as well and think about. Another major myth has to do with tactics, that the primary tactics that African Americans used during this freedom crusade was limited to marches. When we think about, just think about the images of the civil rights movement that will flash before your eyes, and the most dominant image, most common image, is that of the March on Washington, 1963, demonstrations. So major marches, March on Washington, Selma to Montgomery March, children marching in the streets of Birmingham. So we have a march fixation when we think about the tactics of the civil rights movement, but there too, just like goals, there was a wide range, a wide spectrum that we need to think about as well. Obstacles. Another one of the major misconceptions about the civil rights movement is that the primary obstacle or primary opposition were just a handful of bad white people, right? That the issue, the problem, the reason why racism and discrimination existed in America was because of one or two bad white folk, a couple bad sheriffs, either in Birmingham or in Selma. You might have a not so nice governor in Mississippi or Alabama, but it's this idea that the primary obstacle, the primary opposition, are just a handful of bad people, right? So we keep that in mind. And then lastly, the last major sort of category of myths and misconceptions has to do with outcomes. How do we measure movement success? Are we talking simply about sort of victories and defeats in terms of securing that federal legislation? Right? Is the movement a success if you get a bill passed through Congress? And once you get that bill passed through Congress, for example, in 1965, you finally get the Voting Rights Act passed, many people said, good allies of the movement, good white liberal allies here in Ohio, who worked to get the Voting Rights Act passed, said, you got the voting rights bill, what else do you Negroes want? Right? Now everybody's equal, right? Let's move forward. Well, that's not the most important measure of success, right? These bills, of course, become sort of turning points. The beginning, the end of one phase of movement struggle, and the beginning of another phase. So what are we talking about? Let's take a few minutes and just sort of walk through each of these, and just to kind of, so we have in the back of our minds as we begin to explore and probe a little deeper what we should perhaps be thinking about when we break out into our discussions to think about how this might play out here in Ohio. The first, periodization. It's important that we take a long view look at what we call the civil rights movement, a long view look at black protest. The civil rights movement, black protest, was not confined to the 1950s and 1960s. Certainly the 1950s and 1960s stand out as a period of heightened public protest, but that is not certainly the beginning nor the end of the African American effort to gain freedom and equality in the United States. African Americans have been fighting, as Brother Richardson pointed out, when you look at the history of Shiloh, African Americans have been fighting for their basic civil rights and human rights from before slavery ended until this very moment. And within that, I think it is important to also say, when we're thinking about sort of periodization and how do we classify and categorize what we're talking about as the civil rights movement, is that we have to be clear in identifying the difference between protest, which is sort of the activity a movement, an actual social movement, in which you have a common set of ideas and goals and objectives and an underlying philosophy and struggle. Right? Struggle is much more broad, right? And so when I'm with my students and trying to explain to them, or I ask them the question, I say, when did the civil rights movement begin? They'll be like 1619, when black folk first arrived. And I said, well, okay, that's a long movement, right? But we have this idea that movements sort of extend forever. I said, no, what you have starting in 1619 is black folk engaged in a struggle for freedom, right? Social movements themselves, you can't sustain a movement for 250 years, for 400. That's a wee bit too long. You're lucky if you can gain a movement for a couple years because it requires so much involvement and energy and strength. And so when we're thinking about Ohio, I think we will find that there are moments when you have social movements, usually at the local level in various cities and the like. The protests will rise to the level of a movement, but then it will tend to dissipate. Right? Doesn't mean that black protest dissolves and goes away. You always have people engaged in struggle, but it's important to identify, and when we're thinking about places and when places perhaps are at their most significant, to identify, it might be when they are engaged in a movement moment. But that, of course, when you don't see that sort of level of movement activity, doesn't mean that people aren't engaged in protest. I think we do a disservice, actually, when we lump too much in to the idea of a movement. It doesn't take away from black folk engaging in a freedom struggle, but it takes away from what we really need to know about those particular historic moments. Regionalization. What should we be thinking about here? Again, it's important, and this is not something I have to drill in to this group of folk here in Ohio outside of Dixie, but the civil rights movement, black protest, this freedom struggle wasn't confined to the South. The reason why we tend to think that it is because we have framed discrimination, we have framed racism as being something confined to the South. Malcolm X famously said, racism was confined to the South, but the South is everything in America, is everything south of the Canadian border. In other words, even here in Ohio, we've had some issues, right? So we have to think about the African-American freedom struggle, of course, here in Ohio, again, don't need to say, as being something more than just that happens in the South, because discrimination, the problem, is more than what just happens in the South. But this idea of regionalization isn't just national. We have to think about it in a statewide, local context. Certainly, we have black protest, civil rights activism in the 3 Cs, Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati. But we also have to think about and know that you're going to find black protests, you're going to find civil rights activism wherever you have black folk. And so that means in different times, in different places across the 20th century, if that's the context that we're looking at, you got to look to Youngstown and Akron and Toledo and Dayton, cities that had a higher population at particular moments in time. But then you also have to look at some of these older black communities in rural places, some that are still there, some that are no longer there. We have to look at sort of emerging suburbs and see where black folk have been moving. Again, wherever you're going to find black folk, you're going to find people engaged in some kind of protest. So when we're thinking about place, and Brother Anthony said, the power of place, in the Ohio context, we hit the cities, we hit the neighborhoods and communities, but then we also have to think about these other smaller places that usually are not on the radar. The rule of thumb, as I tell my students often, if you want to find black folk engaged in struggle, all you need to do is find black folk. Leadership. We have to, as we're thinking about sort of the movement in Ohio, just as we think about the movement any place, we have to broaden our definition of leadership, broaden our definition of who was a leader and what kind of leadership did they engage in. We have that dominant misconception or myth that the movement was led by Dr. Martin Luther King, that there's just one movement. one national movement, and King was sort of leading it, and obviously that is problematic in and of itself, because what happens then is that if you're framing the movement, this black protest, black struggle, as being something led solely by Dr. King, everything sort of ripples out from there. So then when you're looking in Ohio, if you have sense enough to look for time, well, first you start looking for the movement only at the times and places where Dr. King is present. As though black folk are just sitting around waiting for King to show up and do something, and when he leaves, they go back to sleep, right? So you have to look at places where King is not present, right? You have to look for people who don't look like Dr. King. Right? The other thing is, if we're thinking about this movement as a sort of King-centric movement, then you start looking around for these little sort of mini Dr. Kings, right? Well, if we're going to find leadership, then it must be connected. You must look for Black Baptist ministers. And if not that, we have to look solely at churches. So we have to think about leadership more expansively. Move beyond the sort of King-centric model, and then what do you get? Suddenly you start incorporating, and here's a big surprise, women. Isn't that funny? Women take leadership positions. I always have students every couple of years will come into my class. I teach civil rights, and not too long ago, I had a group of young brothers come in. They're like, Dr. Jeffries, they were all riled up about something. I was happy they were animated. They wanted to do some stuff on campus. And they said, we're ready to go. There was 3 brothers in there. I said, well, where the sisters? He was like, well, we ain't got none. I said, well, y'all ain't going very far. I said, because the history of protest says you got to have women, right? And not just have them. And the reason why you have to have them because they have played these important leadership roles. You don't have a movement without women. So when you move beyond the sort of King-centric understanding of leadership, then suddenly you get women. So when we're thinking about Ohio, we think we have to start looking for the women. You do this consciously, right? Where are the women? That's where you find the protests. You look for young people. You look for elected officials. Now, you're not going to look for them in certain places, right, at certain times. Again, this becomes sort of time-specific, right? When you have moments. You're not going to look for a black mayor in Cleveland in the 1920s, right? So this becomes time-specific. Look for professionals, right? Again, leadership. What does the leadership look like? At different moments in time, you will find black professionals organizing, right? Particularly in sort of public, at those who are working in government, those who hold public offices, business folk. That becomes critically important, especially in the black community. One of the things, and I'll talk about this in a second, we talk about goals. If we think the primary goal of the civil rights movement was voting rights, because we think that the major accomplishment or the end goal was securing federal legislation, then our focus for who we're looking for is connected to electoral politics. But we know that in the long history of sort of the black freedom struggle, it's not about elected officials leading the charge, it's about black business folk leading the charge. So that becomes critically important. And of course, you're going to have church leaders. You are going to have your ministers. But it's just as important to see who is in the pulpit as it is to see who is in the pews, right? So we have to think about that as well. And when we think about sort of church involvement, it's critically important that we not just focus on ministers, but we focus on the lay leadership. We don't just focus on deacons, we focus on deaconesses. See, that's that. I grew up in a Baptist church. I know where the power is. You see what I'm saying? Educators, teachers play a critical role. But then also you got to think about the hustlers. You got to think about these ordinary folk. They were often very critically important in communities to getting things done, getting people connected, to providing black businesses with funds to do the things that they needed to do, providing movement people with funds and space to do the things that they needed to do. One of the things, important lessons that comes out of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a lesson that they learned from Ella Baker was you don't turn away from anybody, right? You reach out to all people. And she knew that was important because her organizing experience told her that if you're just approaching this with a class bias, as the only people who really can make a difference are black middle-class folk, then you really are in trouble and aren't going to get anything done. If we look at a broader range of leaders, our attention will also be drawn to a broader range of black spaces and black places. If we're just confined to the sort of king-centric notion of leadership, then we're going to confine where we look to churches and religious places. If we broaden that out, then the spaces and places that we identify will also increase. We'll look at community spaces where folk gather. We'll look at the importance possibly of bars and dance halls and roller skating rinks and of course barbershops. And if you are thinking seriously about women, you expand that out to beauty shops. So this really becomes connected. And these are spaces and places that are autonomous to a certain extent. And that means both black-owned spaces as well as black-controlled spaces. So a school may not be black-owned, but if the community has control over it, at least at that sort of street level, then that is something that needs to be acknowledged. And of course, we know black housing spaces become critically important. Goals is the next sort of theme I want to bring our attention to. Too often we think about the civil rights movement just in those terms, as something that black folk were fighting for, or what black folk were fighting for were strictly civil rights, those rights that are guaranteed by the government. And absolutely they are. The right to vote, the right to assembly, those rights that are enumerated in the U.S. Constitution, the Ohio Constitution, those are certainly rights that African Americans are fighting for. But the African American freedom struggle, what we call the civil rights movement, again, which is really a misnomer because it's narrowly confined to civil rights, was equally about human rights. There's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that says black folk or people are entitled to decent housing, that people are entitled, nothing in the Constitution that says people are entitled to education. These are human rights. If you want to think about a good list of what human rights are, the United Nations has their Declaration of Human Rights and sort of enumerate these. But this is critically important because this is what black folk are fighting for as well. This combination, I call them freedom rights, this combination of civil rights and human rights. And so if we think expansively, this is how do we begin to identify sort of these important places in Ohio history? Think about the goals. Because if you're not thinking about sort of access to quality housing and decent housing as one of the major goals of the movement, then we won't find the efforts for black folk, for example, to get the state and the federal government to provide quality public housing in the 1930s and the 1940s because there was no way black folk were getting, or the black folk weren't getting access to private sector housing because of discrimination. So we have to identify broadly the full range of goals, and if we do that, then we will have, our eye will be directed towards important places and spaces. Strategies, next theme. And by strategies, I mean sort of the philosophies that undergird black protest. And I mentioned earlier, too often we narrowly define the strategic approach to black protests or to creating change to nonviolence. And there are several reasons why we do that, and why we think about the movement then. This has everything to do with movement memory, the importance of place and memory, why we look back at sort of civil rights activism or black protest and want to frame it explicitly and solely as sort of a nonviolent struggle. And one of the reasons why we do that is because it makes white folk comfortable. Don't nothing scare white folk more than black folk with guns, or black folk being nonviolent, right? So we have to get away from nonviolence as the sole approach, philosophical approach undergirding black struggle. And think about, for example, black nationalism. Think about and how that will manifest itself in various ways. If we're so consumed with nonviolence, and a Christian version of nonviolence, then we won't be thinking about early 20th century mobilization efforts around black nationalism that would not have us thinking about Garveyism and UNIA activity that we might find in places like Cleveland and Cincinnati. We won't think about black institution building and why black folk were coming together, not just because they were excluded from white places, but because they saw value in black places. Right? So we have to think more expansively of that. We can't be afraid when we're talking about civil rights, which is really, we're talking about a broader black freedom struggle. We can't be afraid of black power. Right? Where are the places where you saw black power mobilization? Because black power is truly an extension of what we identify as sort of civil rights mobilizations in the 50s and 60s, which is an extension of earlier forms of black nationalist mobilization. Right? So we have to locate all of that on a continuum. And the labels that we put on it, we can't let that keep us from including that in the broader range of black protests that we are looking at. Tactics, and these two more points. Tactics. We have to get beyond marches. Marches happen, marches are important. We have to identify where and when they occur. But if we're only looking for marches, guess what we tend not to get or look at? Places, right? Marches will happen in public spaces, in public arenas, but we don't think about sort of the organizing that goes into sort of movement mobilization. There were places where people are meeting to plan marches. And these aren't random places. These are places that usually had deep connections in the black community, that were places and sites of political organizing that have to be identified, right? So we have to move beyond sort of mass mobilization moments when thinking about sort of civil rights tactics, and incorporate those things that are usually not visible. Those types of activities that draw people together to challenge power. This is organizing. What groups are organizing people to knock on doors, to get people to come out, to get people to try to register, to get people to run for office, to get people to challenge the school board, to get people to go down to City Hall? We have to think about sort of movement tactics as being mobilization efforts as well as organizing efforts. Institution building becomes a sort of a tactical approach to change. Lobbying, boycotts, economic boycotts become these tactical approaches to change. So when thinking about tactics, just think, again, expand beyond what we're able to capture on television, what newspaper reporters are able to capture in print. Obstacles. This is important, that we think about this because it can help us as we think about what we want to identify in terms of sort of important civil rights activities and places. Too often we think about the main obstacle, the opposition to the African American freedom struggle being one or two out-of-step folk, white folk who now we look back at and say, oh, they were particularly racist. I don't know what particularly racist means, but as though there's a not particular racist people, but the particularly racist people, the bad sheriff, right? We blame Selma on Jim Clark. We blame Birmingham on Bull Connor. We got to be honest with ourselves. White supremacy wasn't confined to one or two bad apples. White supremacy was an American tradition, deeply rooted in the soil of this country. It wasn't confined to the South, it was everywhere. So once we accept that the problem wasn't just one or two bad folk, the problem was white supremacy as it existed in policy and practice throughout the country. So when we're talking about Ohio, we have to move beyond just one or two folk who may have said something at the time and say, okay, what are the policies that are coming out of the state legislature? What are the policies that are coming out of these school boards? What are the practices that real estate boards are engaged in? Right? Think about it not just individually, but structurally. Right? This may not rise to the level, again, of a critical thing for us to think, to discuss, but it has to be something in the back of our minds, because that explains why black folk are doing what the heck. I almost said something else. What the heck that they're doing? What the heck that they're doing? Right? If we don't understand what the obstacles are, what the challenges that they're facing, then what they're doing doesn't make any sense. So that becomes critically important. Also keep in mind that segregation, discrimination, Jim Crow, when we're thinking about Ohio, existed in Ohio. And not just, we often think, well, here it was sort of custom and practice, and down there, wherever down there is, was in law, right? Well, you had segregated laws here, right? Now, many of them, as you sort of evolve over time, right, do not explicitly say black folk, but that's the intent of it. If the intent of the law is to discriminate, it's called de jure discrimination. And so we have to be clear about that too. And don't be surprised when you see it explicitly labeled and explicitly written into law. This will not apply to black folk or the exclusion of black folk. So we have to think about sort of de jure segregation in Ohio as well. And lastly, this, as my home pastor back in New York was saying, this last word and I'm through. Outcomes, outcomes. We have to think about or take the full measure of success. So what defines success in the civil rights context? You know, is a local movement, a local effort successful only if it secures some kind of national legislation? Well, if that's the case, there's only about 2 successful local movements in the civil rights era, the 50s and 60s. We have to think about sort of movement success as well as defeat in a completely different context. There will be some places might rise to the level of significance and importance because there were sites where people came to organize, and they never succeeded in getting a law overturned, but they succeeded in getting people organized, right? That and mobilized and energized and active. And so the immediate goal may have been, you know, X on a public policy front that they never achieved, but then we find that this group of people who were meeting here Sunday after Sunday has achieved something else. So when we think about movement success, when we're thinking about evaluating what is the success of these local struggles in these cities and rural communities, you know, we have to think again expansively about what we're terming a success. It's not always something that can be reduced to the number of people who successfully register to vote or the number of people who cast ballots. Sometimes a movement success in a place where black folk have been paralyzed by fear because of racial violence and other things, a movement success is getting people to come to mass meetings, getting people involved, getting people to come together collectively to help build and improve black schools and black institutions. A movement success, really, if we get the other parts right, then what we begin to identify as movement success and movement defeat and movement victory will begin to become crystal clear by the time we get to that point. So hopefully these 8 or so categories or themes that I think help us, will help us wrap our minds around sort of the African American freedom struggle, civil rights movement here in Ohio. Thank you very much.